A Flash Outside the Off Stump, Episode 10, New Century. Technically, the new century wouldn't start until New Year's Day 1901, but psychologically people were far more likely to greet the change from the 1800s to the 1900s as marking the beginning of a new era. For Ranji, the 1900 season was to be a fairly quiet domestic affair, with no test matches and the chance to consolidate his position as Sussex captain. In individual matches he would put in some truly memorable performances, of which more later, but in terms of his overall career it was perhaps one of his less notable seasons. But 1900 was an important season in other ways, not least because it was the first year in which a West Indies side toured England, although they were still a long way off gaining test status. It also offers us an opportunity to pause in considering Ranji's individual story and look at how racial issues were impacting cricket and vice versa. In retrospect, British imperial expansion is often viewed as being about economic exploitation, coupled with a nationalistic battle for global supremacy with the other great powers of the day. There is no denying these aspects of empire, or that Britain became rich and powerful as a result of her overseas adventures. But by the turn of the century, a moral and political philosophy had developed to justify British imperial policy and to portray it as being kinder and more benign than that of other nations. The British Empire may have been built on slavery and subjugation, but by 1900 its expansion and maintenance was being justified on exactly the opposite grounds. The Empire, and its leading administrators and supporters in Westminster, saw it as a crusading force bringing civilization and liberation, and protecting the helpless from despots, whether they were local rulers or foreign potentates. It is debatable how much Britain's political leaders actually brought into this philosophy, and how much was posturing in order to justify a morally questionable status quo. Ideas about race at the time often promoted the idea that the people of the world had natural strengths and weaknesses according to their particular ethnicity, and that some races were naturally degenerate, while others were naturally superior. As such ideas were always the result of pseudo-scientific studies by European academics, they invariably placed Europeans at the pinnacle of human development. Equally unsurprisingly, the most developed Europeans in such hierarchies would usually turn out to be those of the same nationality as the author. The belief in British cultural superiority was so ingrained by this time that it is probable that many of Britain's political leaders were perfectly sincere in their beliefs, and the more liberal-minded politicians were committed to improving the lives of subject peoples, through education, language and civilising influences such as cricket, with an eye to preparing them for a fuller partnership with their British rulers. Even given that many politicians and administrators had a benign, if somewhat patronising attitude to subject peoples, there was a problem, in that for others the assumption of the racial and moral superiority of the British resulted in contempt rather than concern. Cecil Headlam, who played on an Oxford University Old Boys cricket tour of India, wrote of his experience,
"An Englishman in India soon ceases to be surprised at the resemblance of human beings to monkeys when you see them altruistically picking at each other's heads and otherwise behaving like their cousins in the zoo. The smell of an alien race, of burning cow dung and burning Hindu, no longer offends your nostrils. You learn that you must be very careful how you hit a man in India. Nearly every native suffers from an enlarged spleen, and any blow to the body is likely to prove fatal. It is best to carry a cane and administer rebuke therewith upon the calves or shins. All servants in India are thieves."
Headlam's comments are shocking, but at least go to show that the reality in the colonies was often very different from the rosy picture of benevolent relations which was usually served up at home. Segregation in India was the norm, and would continue to be for some time. This in turn resulted in a contempt and brutality towards native people which unprepared visitors often found shocking. Certainly the Prince of Wales on his tour of India had been struck by it, writing home to his mother, "Because a man has a black face and a different religion from our own, there is no reason he should be treated as a brute." Ordinary British people were rarely troubled by matters of race. Many had never seen a non-white person, and most were proud of Britain's empire and firmly convinced it was a force for good in the world. For such citizens, class distinctions were often far more important and immediate barriers than racial differences. And to some extent this explains the comparative ease with which Ranji won and maintained the support of the public. He was naturally seen as worthy of respect because he was seen as a prince. It is interesting to speculate on whether he would have been taken so readily to their hearts had he have been of lower caste. But had this been the case, he would most probably never have been exposed to cricket or been afforded the opportunity to come to England. Ranji's race was a double-edged sword in terms of his popularity. Some of the public were attracted by his exotic appearance, and it was rumoured in some quarters that he had mysterious, if not supernatural powers. One spectator telling C.B. Fry that, "Yes, he can play, but he must have a lot of Satan in him." While Yorkshire cricketer Ted Wainwright said of Ranji,
"He never played a Christian shot in his life."
Others denigrated Ranji by attempting to claim that he was idolised because of his race rather than despite it. Robert Littleton writing that,
"The English public is a curious one, and one of its peculiarities is a readiness to deify a cricketer all the more because he is not an Englishman and is of a different colour. They would have admired Ranjit Singh as a white batsman, but they worship him because he is black. Many critics are too apt to admire the latest performer, and some have gone so far as to couple the Indian with Grace as equal in merit."
Perhaps Littleton had a point when he said it was too early to put Ranji on quite the same level as Grace in terms of overall contribution to cricket, but his claim about race seems a little unlikely for the time. If Ranji had something that made him more attractive to the public than cricket alone, it was more likely to be his social status than his ethnic origin. Other non-white players also arrived in county cricket over the course of Ranji's career and seem to have received varying receptions which may have been based on class. 2 Indian players from wealthy backgrounds played a few games for Middlesex around the turn of the century as amateurs. Mehalasha Pavri was a doctor and Asan al-Haq a barrister, and both appear to have played without experiencing any problems, although it is difficult to know whether their limited number of appearances was down to prejudice in the selection process or merely that both were dedicated to their professions. 2 players who had much longer county careers were the mixed-race South African Charlie Llewellyn, who played over 300 times for Hampshire, and Derbyshire's Charles Ollivierre, one of the 1900 West Indies tourists, who stayed on in England as the first Afro-Caribbean in county cricket. Llewellyn played a number of times for South Africa between 1895 and 1903, and again between 1910 and 1912. The lengthy gap in his South African Test career is at least partially explained by his residence in England from 1899 to 1910, and he was also selected in the England squad for the Test against Australia at Edgbaston in 1902, although he did not appear in the final 11. Llewellyn's decision to leave his native Natal and play in England appears to have been driven by hostility over his colour at home, and Transvaal batsman Jimmy Sinclair was particularly vocal in his opinion that he should not be allowed to play for South Africa. Llewellyn's 11-year Hampshire career suggests that both player and club were happy with the arrangement, but it has been reported that he eventually left Hampshire because of frequently being refused lodgings for away matches, as well as racism from other team players. For his part, Charles Ollivierre seems to have been particularly popular with Derbyshire fans, and was remembered fondly for many years afterwards, because some of his innings were very good indeed. However, his form was erratic, and this was all too often put down to his inability to adapt to the English climate. It is also noticeable that while the press reports of his successful innings were always fulsome in their praise, racial slurs were apt to pepper the reports of matches in which he made mistakes. Derby Daily Telegraph, 3rd of August 1905. It was a pleasure to see Ollivierre once again making runs. When at the wickets there is no more delightful batsman to watch, and on Tuesday his cricket was most attractive. Hull Daily Mail, Tuesday 5th of July 1904. I've already spoken of a mistake made by Ollivierre when he dropped a catch early on, but the West Indian made ample amends for the error during subsequent play. With the score unaltered from the fall of the second wicket, The dusky one held the ball which Tunnicliffe nibbled out and put straight to him. This was the beginning of a rather trying time for the home side. Hurst, merry as ever, was soon busy with the run-getting and actually made the whole 18 runs added for the 4th wicket off his bat. Then he played under one from Cadman and the darkie had it in a twinkling. Furthermore, at least one of Ollivierre's Derbyshire teammates, wicket-keeper Bill Storer, was not at all welcoming in his views, as cricket writer E.H.D. Sewell later reported. He believed in England for the English and was not enamoured of importations, especially of the ebony hue. Late Victorian society undoubtedly exhibited strong elements of racial and class prejudice, but the way in which the two interacted was often complex and could sometimes be a minefield for the unwary, even if their political experience should have alerted them to possible controversy. In 1888, Prime Minister Lord Salisbury had provoked outrage and a rebuke from the Queen when he had referred to Dadabhai Naoroji, a Parsi candidate for the Holborn by-election, as a black man, and implied that as such the British people were unlikely to elect him. Careful analysis of Salisbury's speech suggests that he meant the public as a whole might be prejudiced rather than himself, but he unfortunately dug himself further into a hole when he responded to the criticism he had received 3 weeks later.
Order! Order!
The word black does not necessarily imply any contemptuous denunciation. Such a doctrine seems to be a scathing insult to a very large proportion of the human race. The people whom we have been fighting at Suakim, and who we have happily conquered, are among the finest tribes in the world, and many of them are as black as my hat. He went on to say, black candidatures are incongruous and unwise. The British House of Commons, with its traditions, is a machine too peculiar and too delicate to be managed by any but those who have been born within these isles.
Order! Order!
The public in London, at least, didn't seem to agree with him. Dadabhai was elected as the Liberal member for Finsbury Central, at which point Salisbury appointed him governor of the Imperial Institute. Shortly afterwards, another Parsi, Manchaji Bhawnagri, became the Conservative MP for Bethnal Green. For Ranjit Singh, 1900 marked a very successful season, in which he led Sussex to a very creditable third place in the county championship, scoring 2,563 runs at the incredible average of 85.43, including 9 centuries and 5 double centuries, including 275 in a bizarre drawn match against Leicestershire, in which both sides scored over 600 in the first innings. As the new year once again slipped by and the new century began in earnest, Ranji was a man at the top of his profession. That same month, Queen Victoria's long and eventful reign came to an end, and Britain and its empire found itself at the beginning of a new era. But impressive as Ranji's figures for 1900 were, there are many other reasons to recall that season, and one of the most noteworthy is that it marked the first visit to England by a West Indies side. And next time we'll be looking at the background to their tour and how they fared.